Hello, welcome everyone to China's surveillance colony in Xinjiang, a conversation with Darren Byler. My name is Gisu Nia, and I'm the director of the Strategic Litigation Project here at the Atlantic Council. The Strategic Litigation Project advises on the inclusion of legal tools as a part of foreign policy, with a focus on prevention and accountability efforts for atrocity crimes, human rights violations, terrorism, and corruption offenses. We also advise and support on legal interventions for victims and survivors of violations and abuses. Rehan Asset, who will be moderating our conversation today, is a senior fellow with the Strategic Litigation Project. She's a human rights lawyer with an anti-corruption background. She's building out a stream of work focused on litigation tools that can address human rights violations in China. Our event today is the third in a series of events we're convening about the treatment of the Uighurs in China. Given the scope of the atrocities affecting that population, it is so important to have experts writing about the scale of the crisis and bringing awareness of these atrocities to the broader global public. So I'm very excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our conversation today is public and on the record. I encourage you all to follow the Atlantic Council's Twitter page, where we'll be tweeting about the event. This event will be recorded and available for viewing on the Atlantic Council website and our YouTube page. We will hear from our speakers, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. If you're in the audience and you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A or chat box located in your control panel to send in questions for the speakers. You can also tweet your question at the Atlantic Council Twitter page, and we'll do our best to get it. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rehan.
Thank you so much, Gisu. I'm so delighted to have this conversation with Professor Darren Byler, an anthropologist who has documented the atrocities that are taking place in Xinjiang. In the Camp is one of the first book-length accounts of the ongoing crisis in the Uyghur region. In it, Professor Darren Byler describes the mass imprisonment through stories of survivors. Their accounts are so horrifying that the word feels inadequate. Like those deployed by other totalitarian governments, the camps and now prisons of Xinjiang are weapons designed to unmake human beings. Although they have been used for mass murder, Professor Byler's book shows how those inside face the destruction of their very humanity and sense of self. Although the book called In the Camps, it also demonstrates that even ostensibly free Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others exist in a kind of imprisonment, subject to constant surveillance and control by the state. The Chinese government's brutal actions in Xinjiang are a continuation of its colonial project in the region. The state has employed campaigns large-scale forced labor, cultural and linguistic repression against its Turkic people in order to remove what it sees as demographic obstacles to stability and turn the Uyghur homeland into an economically and militarily productive arm of Han society. Professor Byler's book is concise, but nevertheless extremely difficult to get through. My own brother Akbar has been held in solitary confinement in Xinjiang for the past several years. Hopefully, In the Camps will refocus the world's attention on the atrocities in Xinjiang with new clarity. I highly recommend everyone to buy and read this book. So Darren, let's dive into the conversation. First, in your own words, and again, for many listeners who are tuning in, can you briefly describe what's happening in today's Uyghur region and why it's happening?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Rehan. What's happening in the Uyghur region, or as it's called in Chinese, Xinjiang, is a process of evaluation and removal of significant portions of the population, primarily the adult population, many men in particular. So around, when we look at the statistics that we have from the state documents, we can see that around 2/3 to 3/4 of the people detained are men between the ages of 18 and 55. So there's a real targeting of a particular generation of people, those of military age, and also the removal of their children, from their homes, being sent to residential boarding schools. And then, as you mentioned, outside of the camps, outside of the formal removal process, there's also these systems of control that prevent people from moving through space and also assign people to particular jobs in factories, often far from their homes. And so there's a process of transforming the population by turning them into industrial workers or prisoners, detainees. And so that, all of society has really been affected by this system, and they call it the People's War on Terror. And the people there that's being evoked are the masses. And so it's a society-wide campaign that is really reminiscent in some ways of older campaigns in China, like the Cultural Revolution, where people in general are mobilized around a particular mission. So that's what's been unfolding over the last several years. It has origins in economic conflict, with Uyghur land being taken from them, and they responding with protests. Though initially those protests were described as separatist incidents, as a way of sort of deflecting blame from the injustice of land seizure towards something that had to do with Uyghur senses of autonomy. But over time, many of those protests, and in some cases violence, were described as terrorism. This is after 9/11. And then, in the 2010s, there were some violent incidents carried out by Uyghurs that attacked Han civilians, a small number of them. And the state used that as a sort of excuse or reason to institute this region-wide campaign. And in some ways they were drawing from counterterrorism strategy that's been deployed in other places, particularly a system called countering violent extremism, which means that you should prevent people from being radicalized. But in the Uyghur case, it's being done at the level of the population and being done through technological surveillance rather than through sort of community informants, as it's done in the US or Europe. So it's something that's novel in the way that it's using technology and the way that it's affecting an entire population of people. And it's really a new form of colonialism. And that's what I'm trying to show in the book.
Yeah, it's personally for me, I mean, the deployment of sophisticated technology creates this tension as to the image that Chinese government tried to create, which means like the classification and characterization of Uyghur as backwarded, extremist, and radicalized group that, and it proliferated throughout Xinjiang. So, and you see like this whole design of these smart city to smart camps against these, the Chinese government's notion of backwarded people and how using the technology to transform them into a better community. So, let's speak from the Chinese government's interest. Like this actually hurts their interest so much. After this kind of incredibly dehumanizing languages that have been utilized and used to portray these people, after, how are they going to represent these community to the rest of the world, including to their Han community, as okay, like these are your neighbors, that we're going to live peacefully together with these people? Like, I mean, you see the tension right there. And for me, like, I mean, does the Chinese government even understand what it's doing? It doesn't even serve its interest. While talking about the human rights issue, I don't like using the state's interests. But at the same time, when I think about the victims and their constant and this prolonged suffering, perhaps like one way is to argue like, this is against the Chinese government's interest for them to have reverse their policy. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure. I mean, so there's changes in state interests, and there's responses to the overreach of the past. So one of the things that they were trying to do in the 1990s and 2000s was something that they called "Open Up the West," which was about building infrastructure and bringing Han settlers into the region as a way of integrating it with the rest of the country. And I think initially they thought, oh, this will be a way of sort of bringing Uyghurs into the Chinese system, and gradually over time, all boats will rise. But they didn't protect the Uyghur population from forms of discrimination, from forms of corruption, from the way that their institutions were taken from them. They actually incentivized, Han people to take over the banking system, the school system, all of those things. And so, the rise in tension in the region is a response to that economic dispossession. And now, like you're saying, they've now criminalized an entire population, or said that they were guilty of terrorism and extremism crimes that were not serious. This is in the state document that the Chinese government sent to the UN. And so that means that there's this entire generation of Uyghurs who have been turned into criminals, people that were just regular folks for the most part, but that prayed, went to the mosque, fasted during Ramadan, really normal Muslim stuff, and now have been deemed criminal. And so for that entire population of people, there's a kind of stigma that's associated with them, both that they carry, and in their communities, their families carry this as well, where people now see these people as a criminal population, because the state has said that they are. They've widened the scope of what counts as extremism or terrorism to such an extent. And so, that means that this entire generation of people are marginalized and can be made can be put to work in state-assigned jobs, and paid very little. And it doesn't really seem as though there's a way of sort of escaping that kind of stigma. I think the state, though, feels like it's the children that they can really work on, because they're being sort of parented in the state institutions, in these residential boarding schools. In Chinese, they're being taught to see Uyghur traditions, to see religious practice as something that's lacking and something that they shouldn't participate in. And so I think the state feels as though it's that generation of Uyghurs, the next one, that they can more fully integrate into the country. But like you're noting, residential schools don't work well. I mean, we see that in North America, with the way that Native Americans have been treated. It produces generational trauma, and these Uyghurs that are being put into these schools, they're going to come out of them with a sense of dislocation, with a sense of alienation, and of course they're still carrying with them this racialized kinds of prejudice that the state has associated with their ethnicity. So it does really feel like we're moving into a spiral of trauma that will last for generations.
Yeah, and for our listeners, this idea of extremism, or the term extremist terrorists, have been deployed by many governments, but I want to make it very clear that the people in the camps today, that they're innocent people. And when the Chinese government uses these terms as a pretext to put people in the camps, in fact, if anything, I could be in that camps. I narrowly escaped the Chinese government's concentration camps because my brother is there, and knowing that this has already happened to him, I haven't gone back. Had I gone back, I would definitely be in the camps, and I would be labeled as an extremist, and whatever terms that they could come up with. And in my brother's instance, they said he incited ethnic discrimination, when he is the ethnic who has been systematically oppressed by the state, but still learned how to excel within the framework that state offered to the Uyghurs. So I just want to be very clear on that. I think, in my view, the re-education camp system is set up to monster Uyghurs. The dehumanization and everything, because and I think in your book, it just comes out so clearly. It empowered the Han people, and this really hurts me, while hurting the Uyghurs' self-worth and sense of dignity, right? And this shows that, for me, it would be very difficult for Han, the majority, to become allies to the Uyghur people. And in fact, if I could quote some of the discussion that you had with one of the survivors, she said, many Han people involved in the re-education appeared to develop a sense of empowerment and investment in the campaign. Kalbuna recalled that another Han worker shouting that, telling her, right now Uyghurs are like flies, we can just sweat them if they like. And then another person who saw like Han neighbors gathered in the hall outside of his apartment and applauded when people are taken away, saying like, excellent work and please take them away. Now, I don't believe that the Han people in the region, I think are, because I've seen that kind of self-empowerment. Some of my friends from Wuhan ended up going to the Xinjiang region and they suddenly changed because the state empowered them. Better employment opportunities, better salary, like, better access to resources and everything. And that supremacy was just like, it's so innate. You develop it by being in the region. So as somebody who truly believes in Han people must speak up in this crisis for us to end it in the first place, it almost seems like through you reading your book, it's impossible for them to become allies in the region. And does it mean that if that is the case, global solidarity is the only solution to end this crisis?
Well, global solidarity is an important element of it, for sure. So I think, there's a lot of Han people in the Uyghur region, 9 to 10, 12, 11 million, depending on what data you're looking at. And a good portion of those people are people that see themselves as Xinjiang people, as Bendi Ren, or local people, Lao Xinjiang. And some of them, those that didn't grow up in a segregated system, like with the Bingtuan, which is quite different from the rest of the society. The Bingtuan is a military, paramilitary, sort of farming corporation. And it's almost all Han in that group. And, they're also involved in the prison and camp system. And many that grew up in that system, don't really see themselves as Xinjiang people. So I'm talking about people that grew up sort of at the margins of that and closer to Uyghur society, and really see Uyghur food as their food, and saw their Uyghur neighbors as, their friends. Many of those people, they don't believe the state rhetoric when it comes to the sort of terrifying of Uyghurs, that they, are all potential terrorists. They think that, Uyghurs are relatively good people. They maybe are, bad people within Uyghur society, but in general, they're like everyone else, good people. And they see that what's happening to them is as a racialized kind of state violence. And I think among them, there is some sympathy and within their social network, I think they do try to help Uyghurs to some extent. So, I hear from Uyghur friends about their Han neighbor, letting them use their phone to get information out about their whereabouts and safety and things like that. Or, trying to help get people out of the camp or detention center before they're sent to the camp, by, trying to bribe, higher level people, or trying to work sort of within the state apparatus to get people released. So there is some solidarity, I think, among some of those, but most people have come more recently, particularly in the south part of the region. And I think they're more like the people you're talking about, people that feel empowered by this system, kind of have a conqueror's sort of attitude. In some cases, those that I interviewed in 2018, I interviewed around a dozen of these Han volunteers in Kashgar and other places. They said that, this is going to be difficult for the Uyghurs, but it's in their best interest. Since Uyghurs are backward, and, through the camp system, they'll learn Chinese, they'll be placed in jobs, and so they'll become less backward. And so in the end, it'll be better for them. So it's a kind of tough love, I think, feeling that they have. Others, though, there's just real antipathy towards Uyghurs. They feel like they're the reason why the Xinjiang identity is denigrated. They feel like, if it wasn't for the presence of the Uyghurs, Xinjiang would be a great place for Han people to live. And so really it's about really the elimination of Uyghurness, I think, for many Han people. And then outside of Xinjiang, there's the vast majority of people, I think, agree with the state's position. They think that, this is the state fighting terrorism. They're protecting us. It's great. And people that say that it's not are just, imperialists who, have sympathies with the U.S. But there's also, I think, particularly those that are in urban locations and have access to international media, a real growing awareness of what's happening in Xinjiang in terms of the camp system and how dehumanizing it is. And so I think there is some solidarity there that I think is building over time. And I think, you see that in some moments where there's space is open for people to talk. And I know you were involved in the Clubhouse meeting that happened a few months ago, or longer now, where there was thousands of Han people speaking in Chinese about what had been done and what is going on. Some of them from Xinjiang itself, really talking in very direct ways about what had been done, and really looking for ways of building solidarity. So that's, I think, the landscape in a sort of general sense of what's in play. I think within China, building more awareness is really important. One of the things, and I should mention this, that has really come out of Han solidarity is the way that we have more information about the state's actions because of people leaking things from within the state apparatus. So there are people that are resisting, but it's in quiet, small ways. And that's because there's a major threat that's placed over them as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you talked that there is a future for local solidarity and even resistance between the Han and Uyghur people. Like Han people, some of them even like lending their phone or to get more information as to the family members, because that's something that I feel like very passionately about. That I do believe that Xinjiang is a very pluralistic region, and even before Shanghai was able to host expats, like Xinjiang has been home to many expats throughout the history, and just seeing this region completely being torn apart and having because of the state creating this kind of tension between the ethnic communities and as well as the majority Han, who sort of became majority because of the state's migration policy, and that's a fact. It's really disheartening for me. But sometimes I am worried. But at the same time, even at Yale, I was giving a lecture, and a student came up to me. She is from Xinjiang, and then she was just she was from I think Lanzhou, and then she was very emotional about it. Like, some of her relatives are in Xinjiang. She's like, we know all this happening, but we can't do much about it. So I'm glad that you and I we remain hopeful for a better future. And one thing that for me is they're just so many things, but just on this point, let's just let me just double it down a little bit. But there's one, with that hope, I also don't have a hope, just a little bit, because now the Chinese Han community there, their privilege has increased relative to the Uyghurs. And that is the paradox that we have to overcome and we have to address. So given the privileged status that the Han people enjoy, do they even want this crisis to end, you think? Are there incentives for them to think, oh, this crisis that must end?
I think they do want it to end, but I don't think they want truth and reconciliation for the most part. They don't want to pay for what they've done. They want to act, I think, now as though it never happened. And it seems as though the state at least is moving from sort of mass internment to mass incarceration to more of, rather than a kind of indeterminacy where people could potentially be released in some way, they're instead now placing them in prisons as a kind of warehousing of them and keeping them, indefinitely, it feels, in prison spaces. And they're also, I think, now beginning to retract some of the surveillance equipment, some of the checkpoints. are no longer functioning. Part of that I think has to do with the cost of running those systems, of maintaining them. As the technology that they were using is very expensive, to build and then also to maintain. And so if it feels as though it's not really necessary, it's not to have all of this surveillance, maybe they're going to prioritize other kinds of economic investment going forward. So, I think they want the emergency of the crisis maybe to end, and the sort of war footing of like, having to stand guard. Like if you're in your unit, you have to go like on night duty and act like a watchman or something, for no reason. Those sorts of obligations, or like volunteering to go live in a Uyghur's home, which is over 1 million people, mostly Han people, had to do that kind of work. That's something that they see as really inconvenient. So I think they want to stop doing that, but I think they want still to continue the benefits of having Han privilege really extended in this really dramatic way. One of the things I noticed in my interviews with Han migrants to the region is they would say, it's so much better here than in Shanghai or Beijing, where the government doesn't want us and they, actively try to kick us out of the city. Here, this government really protects us, and we have so many jobs. The cost of living is lower. So it's like, it's a place I could see myself living for the rest of my life. And so they really see Xinjiang as like a frontier space that welcomes migrants, and will provide jobs and protect them going forward. And I think that's just been accelerated through the camp system.
You brought up like such a good point. Like, only recently I sort of like start to become, it's really hard for me to even repeat this word, like an exile life. Like, but in Shanghai, like, Shanghainese, like they have this certain sort of like a local pride of like belonging to this like a very prosperous city of China. And they only speak the local dialect. They don't even speak Mandarin. And, like the state didn't try to like assimilate them into the broader culture. And as you said, in fact, Shanghainese try to like, they don't like when other people come to the region. They kind of even ostracize them or look down upon them. Oh, you're from Henan, like I'm the Shanghainese. Like they have this sense of privilege, whereas like the opposite is true in Xinjiang when the settlers come, but they end up having the privilege. So why wouldn't they want that? And that is the incentive, which is created by the government. But talking about the surveillance state, that's for those who are not familiar with the sophisticated and incredibly intrusive surveillance state that the Chinese government created in Xinjiang, the scale of power of Xinjiang's surveillance system is almost inconceivable. And you really documented things that before I didn't notice, like from the inconvenient, what is it called? People's convenience card, like, that was a racially profiling card, but people were not even aware of that at the time until like it developed into what it is now. This like the demonstration of a perfect Orwellian state as it is now. For example, a camera in the region had been equipped with an Uyghur alarm that can detect Uyghur facial features. I mean, this is what the skill that we're talking about. But the companies, and this is like where I want to talk about the corporate complicity. The companies involved in developing and supporting this technology are either based in the US or like Oracle, or have engaged in lobbying here. So these are not just Chinese companies, but also Western companies that are involved in dehumanizing of the Chinese government's repression in the region. And as in the case of the lobbying, as in the case of Megvi, I believe. And so this is why I believe this is an international issue, but in your view, how this surveillance state, Xinjiang, is an international issue that we should all be worried and concerned about?
Yeah, well, it certainly is an international issue. So I think, to understand the role of technology or like Silicon Valley in the system, I think we need to just think most broadly about the culture of Silicon Valley, which has to do with, rapid prototyping, building things as quickly as possible to expand your market share, and not necessarily thinking about the the potential consequences of your technology. What is it going to actually do to those that are in vulnerable positions, those sorts of things. So it's really a kind of culture of entrepreneurial development, and not thinking about the consequences for lower status people. And then, an element of that, sort of counterintuitively, is open sourcing of knowledge. And so once you publish something or you build a data set, you should make it available to everyone. And in the mid 2010s is when there was major breakthroughs in computer vision technologies, in artificial intelligence. And one of the things that they were working on at the time were facial recognition systems. And so there was a number of data sets that were made available for everyone. And one of them was from the University of Washington, another from Microsoft, another from Duke. And you can see that the Chinese tech firms that were being built, that were being founded at that time, really found their footing through that open source technology. And so they downloaded it. They began to work with it. Many of the technologists that work in these firms come from Microsoft, or were trained at MIT or University of Illinois, University of Washington, Stanford, and they end up in these firms, beginning to build new systems. And initially in China, they were building the same sorts of security features that you'll probably see on your smartphone, face unlock kind of tools. But then over time, it became something about working with state security to do forms of mass surveillance. And the Edward Snowden revelations, I think it helped to sort of legitimate that sort of process. Large tech firms in China said, oh, we can see that the tech firms in the US are doing this. And of course, they had been working with the state security in China already, but they began to work in a much more concentrated way, particularly after the incident in Kunming, where there was an attack by Uighurs on Han civilians. And they said, this is China's 9/11. We have to have a concentrated national program to target Uighurs. So that's sort of the origins of these technologies. In terms of specific technologies that are being used, you can see that the data set that the police are using in Urumqi, at least, is built on Oracle software that's open source. It's not like Oracle was necessarily contracted with the police in Xinjiang, but it is like an Oracle data set, the infrastructure of it. And of course, like the microprocessing chips that they're using are coming from Intel and other places. So there is elements within the technologies itself that are coming from the West, or were coming from the West. But most of it is really about the knowledge transfer, and sometimes it's in at the level of the person that's going from one company to another. But in general, it's about a culture of surveillance that's been built over the last decade, and now pervades so much of technology, and how that is now expressed in China, where there is no protections for vulnerable populations, or very little protections. And so it's taking surveillance really to the limit and seeing what it can do at the level of a population. And the Uyghurs become a space for experimentation in that kind of surveillance.
One anecdote you gave, people often talk about the US as I think they mostly refer to DC being this revolving door, but or in the US in the larger context, like people changing from profession very often or getting government position. But one anecdote you gave, it was this Bloomberg business journalist now lobbying for one of the Chinese companies, which has been sanctioned by the US for enabling this repression through surveillance technology. And for me, that was just fascinating. You would assume journalists would at least strive to be on the right side of the history. And I think that's the kind of things that we all need to condemn and call out. I think we do have a few questions. I do have a few questions, but I think I'll take more from the audience and then if we still have time, then I'll ask my question, because I'm really interested in two-faced person angle that you mentioned in the piece as well. So the first question is from Patrick Delzel, who asked how much Han immigration is there in the Uyghur area?
Well, there's quite a lot. Much of it has come since the 1990s, particularly into the southern part of the region. So the Uyghur homeland, the what was historically called the six cities, the Alta Sheher, are all in the south of the region, which is a large area. Xinjiang itself is the size of Alaska. And in the 1990s and 2000s is when we started to see large numbers of Han people being recruited to go to southern Xinjiang, to these Uyghur majority areas, and really build the infrastructure to get at the oil and natural gas that were in the region. And then over time to develop industrial scale agriculture, cotton farming in particular, but also tomato farming and a bunch of other sort of raw materials that can be used in other parts of the country. So that's really the moment, the 90s and 2000s, a 2-decade moment when Uyghur society really began to change because of Han migration. And it's not as though that Uyghurs became a minority in those spaces. They are still a majority, but they lost the positions of power within the institutions of their societies. So that's when controls on who could teach in the mosque, who could go to a mosque begin to emerge. But beyond that, the schooling system and all of these other institutions began to be transformed. And so that's really when Uyghurs started to think that they were losing their way of life. And an additional thing beyond that is that the cost of living began to rise, but Uyghurs were excluded from new jobs, from jobs that would provide for them in the new economy. And so it's like what you see in a system of gentrification, where people that are in a community and then receiving large numbers of people who have more wealth and more power begin to arrive, and rents begin to rise, the cost of basic staples begin to rise. And so you see yourself being further impoverished, even though you're doing the same job you were doing before. So that's the process in general that migration has brought to the Uyghurs. Since the camp system began, which was really its largest build out was 2017, we've seen a lot of recruitment of Han people to the region, both to work in the camp system, to work in the school system. They hired 90,000 new teachers, 60,000 grid workers, although many are from the population. The grid workers are the low-level police who manage the checkpoints. And so there's been a lot of hiring for the security apparatus, but beyond that, they're also recruiting people to take the land because they're removing Uyghurs and Kazakhs from their land and sending them to work in factories. And that land then becomes available for new owners, really, for companies to build out new kinds of industrial agriculture. So that's the process that's in play right now.
Yeah, and I think gentrification is a good framing as to what's happening in Xinjiang, but also let's not forget. I mean, Xinjiang is very rich with very mineral resources, and often when people Han migrants came there, the Chinese government actually allocated these resources first to Han people, and also able to aid the other regions in Shanghai or other cities. And I feel like that's something that often doesn't get to talk about, but I'm glad you talked about that in your book, especially at the beginning as well, to give the incentive as to why the government is cracking down this region in particular, in addition to obviously the Turkicness or Uyghurness of the society as a whole. So the second question is, would you agree that a glaring deficiency of AI ethics is their criticism of AI issues only in the developed democracies generally, while ignoring abuses such as CCP use of facial recognition to identify and imprison Uyghurs in concentration camps?
Well, certainly there's a sort of preoccupation or primary focus on Western societies, and when it comes to AI ethics or critique of surveillance technology. And to some extent that makes sense, because that's where most of the technology, or much of the technology, is being built. But there's also, people everywhere in the world are using technology. Sometimes they're using Western technologies, or Facebook is the internet of Myanmar and the Philippines, and WhatsApp is the internet of Brazil. And I hope that Facebook, I know that Facebook is not doing as much as it should to control the way that their technologies are being used in those spaces. They can be used to promote hate speech, to promote disinformation, the same sorts of issues that we have in the US, but that are amplified that go far beyond actually the effects that we see here. Because they can produce genocidal violence, in the case of Myanmar and the Rohingya. And so I think tech firms in the US have a lot of responsibility for what happens to their technology when it travels. I think we also, though, need to think about other forms of technology that are being built in places like China, in places like India, and the way that they affect marginalized populations that are at a different scale in some ways than the effects of technology, the technology harms that we see here, because they're often used to target whole populations of people. And in both cases, in India and in China, they're really building on war on terror rhetoric and the excesses of that to justify new systems of oppression of Muslim populations, and not only to justify it. It's not just the discourse that they're using, they're also actually using the strategies and techniques, the very technologies that are being used in counterterrorism elsewhere, but to different effects. And so I think we need to think about a critique of global war on terror as well. What does it mean when the war on terror is happening in your own state, and when it's being used to target populations as a whole? And so, yes, I agree with the questioner that we do need to extend ethics beyond the US framework to think about what happens in these other spaces, these new forms of racialization, where people are being targeted based on their ethnicity, using biometric tools. Like, it's really at the level of the skin. Rehan, you were talking about how they're measuring people's eyes and nose to racialize them, to decide what their ethnicity is. So we need to think about, how these new technologies are being racialized in these other spaces, and our own complicity in allowing them to happen. And the tech community is really just turning a blind eye for the most part. Like, you still see these companies sponsoring major conferences. You see collaborations between tech firms, in the US and in China. Costco is still selling Hikvision and Dahua cameras, even though those, that's the company that built, $900 million worth of smart camps in Xinjiang. So there's lots of complicity to be shared and should be pointed out.
Yeah, there's just like so much dehumanizing that is happening. And, while there's so much discourse on ethics and AI here in the United States, I think it's really important that we need to focus on countries like China, where it is the full demonstration of how the technology can be used for negative and dehumanizing purpose. And, for me, I often worry that this would create a negative trend for the states as to how they engage with their minority population. And because oppression always travels, dictators always emulate from each other. And I think we're already seeing these trends. It's not so much as the Chinese government handing out these technologies by examples, is already setting in new norms and being able to get away with impunity. And that is the kind of things that we really need to focus. And I know, Darren, you briefly talked about, yourself, you could totally pass for Uyghur in the Uyghur region. And just having that little beard, I guess, it could be a fashion in some sense, but you're already marked as an extremist, and you were flagged too. Because of that facial feature. And for me, this kind of predictive policing we may call, how the state is using algorithm to sort of profile like Uyghur certain facial features, like, and then just putting them into the camps just based on these algorithm and the AI technologies, dehumanizing. Perhaps you could speak from that fact to explain like what happens to the Uyghurs as they pass through the security system, and especially after some of them already marked as a person, they call it a threat to the government's existence.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the most damaging form of technology that was used was actually not face recognition as much as digital forensics. So throughout Xinjiang, the police departments have purchased devices called counterterrorism swords, which are devices that use a USB cord to plug into your phone. And so, in 2017, as they were hiring all of these grid workers, the people that man the People's Convenience Police stations, which are surveillance hubs every 200 to 300 meters, where there's often checkpoints. And the people they hire are contracted police. They're called Xinjiang, or assistant police. And their job, after they got those counterterrorism swords, was to scan people's phones. And so people's phones, their digital history from the years before was looked at. And they're matched against 50 to 70,000 different markers of extremist or political activity that are very wide ranging. I mean, some of them have to do with like the Islamic State and stuff, but many are not that. They're about Uyghur history. They're about studying Quran, being part of a Quran study group on WeChat, which back in 2014 and 15, when I was doing field work, was very widespread. Lots of young people were doing it. Those scans of their phone was one of the primary ways that they decided who should be sent to the camp. I mean, in the book, I talk about Baimarat, who's one of these Xinjiang and grid workers who scan people's phones. And he said you would get a reading that would say, no, this person had gone to the mosque or had pictures of people with beards or women with veils on, in his digital history or her digital history. It would also look through social contacts. So like, who you had in your contact list, who might have been living abroad, who was a family member of someone who was living abroad. So it was mapping social network in a very fast way. And, through the reading, it would give a diagnosis of what this person was. Are they trustworthy, normal, or untrustworthy? And the untrustworthy people, the people that had a red warning, were the ones that needed to be detained for further questioning. And I found through my interviews that most of the people that were detained for digital crimes, for having WhatsApp on their phone, using a VPN in the past, having bought a secondhand phone that had a video on it from the previous owner, or it wasn't even on the phone anymore, but there was still a history of the thing being downloaded. Having more than one phone registered to your ID, which was widely done in Xinjiang before. These are all things that weren't crimes when they were done, but were criminalized after the fact. So, when people were doing them, they didn't think that, 4 years from now, this is going to be outlawed, and then I'm going to be put into camp for what I'm doing.
Right.
So it's after the fact criminalization. So that's the primary way that they're detained. And then once they've been scanned, they know that their digital behavior is being tracked. And most people have had their phone scanned at least 10 times over the course of a year or so. And so they know it's an iterative process. It's scanned over and over again. And they've also now built all these checkpoints where you have your face scanned and you're matched to your ID. So they know that your movement is being tracked. And those that are put on a watch list because they have a relative in a camp, or they've been in a camp and then been released, they're only permitted to travel within certain grids within the space that they live. So they're under a kind of neighborhood arrest at all times. And to move beyond it, you need to get official permissions. If you try to go without permission, there will be an alarm that sounds, and then you'll be questioned. You could be detained again. So that's how the digital enclosure really begins to control movement and behavior in the most intimate of ways. And you would think that you could just step out of the system, not use your phone, but they're also making sure that you carry your phone with you. So it means that there's not really an outside to this kind of surveillance.
Yeah, like I think it's worth mentioning that Xinjiang is like a no-right zone. Like, I mean, this phone, like this is my personal property. The state technically, I mean, here in America, nobody can just take it away without probable cause, like, to say that, they're gonna search my phone to see what's happening. But in Xinjiang, in no-right zone, like the state just can grab it, and you could have like literally like a WhatsApp, or maybe like you have a relative you send a message to, then you're already marked as an untrustworthy person, which means that the likelihood of you being sent to the re-education camps would be increased. And that is the reality of what's happening in the Uyghur region. Like sometimes like I feel like we're living in this like, it's so unreal, like this is actually happening, like and the Orwell's 1984, I mean, this is exactly happening. It's so inconceivable. And I think while we're still on the technology, I think there's one question on surveillance. Do you think the US Department of Homeland Security is taking lessons from Xinjiang during their development of the HARP system for migrant surveillance at the border?
Well, I don't know who's taking lessons from whom exactly. It could go either way, really. I think initially China was taking lessons from the U.S. for sure when it came to advanced technology and surveillance, and the potentials for it. At this point, I think China is really leading the field now when it comes to computer vision technologies, at least. So it might be reversed, but I think that there's probably not a direct relationship between the technologies as they're being developed for the most part. Although, like, I know that some of the firms that were working in Xinjiang were saying, like, we're trying to do what Palantir is doing in the US. And they would say that really directly, but that was 3 or 4 years ago. So I don't know who's ahead now. At the southern border of the US, they are using similar tools. So a colleague of mine, Carolina Sanchez-Bo, who's an anthropologist who works in Texas, has been working with asylum seekers who come across the border. And during the Trump administration, there was lots of those asylum folks that were being put in camps. The camps were too crowded. And so in some cases, they were given ankle bracelets, but in other cases, they were given an app on their phone that would, that was a face scan app where they would have their face scanned on a regular basis and uploaded to the ICE agent. And the phone was also tracking their movement through space. And then you can see that in some cases, arrests by immigration authorities were associated with the movement of people's phones or the movement of the ankle bracelet that they might have had, and the way that they were associating with other undocumented people. And so there's a way that people are being tracked through space, the way they're being stigmatized in terms of what kind of work they can do. But the scale is quite different relative to what's happening to the Uyghurs. It's not on the level of millions of people. That said, the technologies are, aspects of them are similar. What's happening in Xinjiang is different in terms of scale and density. So there's many more checkpoints than you'll see in most other places. And many more human, data police, people that are making sure that the checkpoints are working as they should. And then the manual scanning of phones and all of that, that goes well beyond what we've seen anywhere else in the world. Although yeah. I should say, West Bank and Palestine, maybe, it might rival it in some ways.
And I think the States has a very good manual as to how to run these camps, and I think, and also like the amount of dehumanizing and political indoctrination and forced confessions that are taking place there. Like the detainees, these innocent people, have to confess, and these are forced confession to say that they are extremists. Like it's just truly horrifying. One thing I think, Darren, I know one of the key aspects of this while trying to give voice to the survivors, again, like because you are trying to portray several different ethnic communities, and one angle like you focus on is the religious angle, which is, and I think throughout our discussion you also talked about the US war on terror and how the Chinese government really utilized the language of the war on terror to portray Uyghurs as and also align itself with the West at a time in it served its interest, right? To really truly start what is became now like a sort of crackdown to repression, and then now the crimes against humanity. For me, like, and happy if you could challenge me on this, also provide like alternative narrative. The Uyghur population itself is a very pluralistic society. And for decades, the Chinese government actually like prohibited people from practicing religion. I think many people in the urban setting, like myself, we grew up without practicing any form of religion, and including our parents who work for government or work in the university. Especially if you go to mosque, like it says, like, anyone between the age of like certain, like you're not even allowed to practice religion. It's totally prohibited. So there is like a very much ethnic persecution, like, the fight against the Uyghurness, or this very much a Turkic identity of sharing this cultural heritage with Turkic people, and being proud of their own sense of identity. So if you could just talk to that, so that people don't I don't want to be there some sort of like misconception as like, oh, these are just like this Muslim people. At the time Islamophobia was rising.
Well, right. So, it's not only about Islam, it's also about who Uyghurs are as a people. Because Uyghurs have an ancestral homeland, which is the region they live in, and they speak their own language, which is Uyghur. They carry forward ancestral traditions that are, really indigenous in many ways to this space, and are connected to the land, their sacred land, that really is the center of their identity. All of that means that their claim to sovereignty in this space is heightened because of who they are as a people, and then because they look different and they can't pass as Han for the most part. That difference is further accentuated and seen as threatening to the state. So there is that component to who Uyghurs are and why they're being targeted. When I was looking at in 2010 is a particular moment when digital technology really arrived for the first time, and people could get online, use smartphones, and there was sort of a turn to a global Islamic identity among people in rural positions throughout southern Xinjiang. And Uyghurs are classified as like 80% rural by the state. Not to say that they really are, but that's how they're classified. Many are farmers, and people in those positions are in Uyghur majority spaces where they don't really grow up speaking Chinese. But there is, like you said, others, that 20% that do live in urban locations, and have assimilated to a greater extent, I think, into Chinese society, speak Chinese, and are often less religious. And those folks were also targeted. We see cultural leaders, like the leading professors, the presidents of the universities, people like your brother, being taken away and given long prison sentences that really have nothing to do with Islam or Islamic practice. These are model minorities, really, or that's how they were talked about before. Many of them are party members, and they were really trying to build a better society and doing what they could within the Chinese system.
Yeah.
And now they've been taken away. So that I think shows us something about the way the state is really treating Uyghurs as an other that should be eliminated and replaced with something new. And they're really targeting the people as a whole, which is why this should be talked about as a crime against humanity, in addition to being an excessive use of rhetoric of terrorism and all of that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Darren. This was very insightful. And, in addition to giving voice to the survivors and the victims, like what this book is actually dedicated to Rahila Dawood, who is a very renowned anthropologist and dear colleague of Darren Byler. And her daughter, Akida Pulat, actually was part of the documentation. And I can imagine her sitting through these interviews and tuning in to survivors' account, while knowing that her mom is exactly going through the same kind of inhumane treatment and torture and so forth. So I think like if you truly believe that, care about this crisis and believe that survivors and their voice matter, then read the book, buy the book, and to make sure that, there would be a renewed focus on these atrocities. And I really hope that, we'll continue the discussion with Darren. Again, thank you so much, Darren, for coming into the Atlantic Council. And I hope like your book would do well deservingly.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.